Lightning Returns needed to be made. The 7th console generation was famously hard for most Japanese game companies, but it was particularly difficult for Square Enix. All their big console initiatives failed in some way. The Fabula Nova Crystallis games didn't take off as they had hoped, and Versus 13 was delayed indefinitely. Final Fantasy XIV launched to global hatred and failure, and a failed MMO is a money pit they'd probably never be able to dig out of. Games like Nier and Drakengard 3 might have had a cult audience, but they were never going to be major sales successes. No matter what the popular sentiment was, the 13 Trilogy was the only reliable success the Japanese division of Square Enix had on consoles. Never mind that the ending of 13-2 necessitated a sequel. With Chaos taking over Grand Pulse and Doom circling Square Enix headquarters, would Lightning be able to save them both? Well, no, not really. Lightning Returns sold well enough, but sold worse than the first 2 games in the trilogy. It justified its development costs, but didn't make much impact monetarily or culturally. As for Grand Pulse, it died. Lightning didn't even get a try to save it. Her mission in Lightning Returns isn't saving the world, it's evacuating as many people as she can off of it. This game was never going to change Square Enix's fortunes, and Lightning was never going to save her home. Lightning Returns feels, both in gaming history and in narrative, like a game made out of necessity. Its required existence allowed the team to swing for the fences on some of the game's core elements, both to the game's benefits and detriment. That leads to a game that's more interesting than 13-2, but even more flawed than the original 13. Lightning Returns cements this trilogy as a one-of-a-kind experience, but makes certain that whether that experience is a good or bad one will depend entirely on the person. Much like the first 13 game, the modus operandi of Lightning Returns is to buck JRPG traditions and do its own thing. A good show of this is in the game's first few hours, in which the entire story, gameplay loop, and game structure are laid out plainly. Lightning Returns wastes no time getting players to actually play the game, skipping the preamble and build-up RPGs often rely on to introduce players to the game. If you're playing Lightning Returns, you probably played the 2 preceding games. No need to waste time, you know the situation. The chaos of the afterlife spilled into the world of the living at the end of 13-2, causing an end to the natural cycle of life and death. 500 years have passed since then, and no one has aged a single one of those days. For humanity, time has stopped. Children still inhabit the bodies of children, with 500 years of life crammed into them. Adults locked into their middle-aged years. The world around them crumbling bit by bit, eroding the land to 4 distinct landmasses that the remnants of humanity huddle into. The world has been ending for centuries, and now it only has 13 days left. The god above all others, Vunavelza, is determined to build a new world free of the chaos. He awakens Lightning from her crystal prison and gives her a single mission: save as many souls as she can to populate the new world. With that, Lightning Returns has done all the setup it needs. The players let loose into the world to help whoever they can. The first thing that struck me is how much and how quickly Lightning Returns departs from the established tone and aesthetics of the 13 trilogy. Upon arriving in Luxarion, Lightning is greeted by a murder scene. A young girl's corpse is lying on the ground with a knife in her back. Her pink hair is strikingly similar to Lightning's, and just as she is coming to that revelation, a dummy dressed like Lightning is hung from a tower behind her. Apparently, the Doomsday scenario didn't already give the game a gloomy enough tone. I'd go as far as to say that the game borders on edgy. It's strange, because the rest of the trilogy is similarly hopeless and harsh in its stories and themes, but the previous games didn't exhibit a need to prove how dark they were. The apocalypse would give this game the same heavy nature, but admittedly, going a bit over the top does make it stick out a bit more than the others. Things are different here visually as well. The most consistently enjoyable thing about 13 and 13-2 were their aesthetic. Hyper-futurist architecture, sleek menus, colored lights, and holograms strewn all over the place. A layer of bloom that made so many 7th generation games age poorly did the exact opposite here. Every object shimmers in the light in a way that accentuates the heightened feel of the futuristic setting. All of that was contrasted by the uncivilized wilds of Pulse. It blended equal parts jungles, steppes, savannas, and canyons to give a really distinct topography and agriculture. Lightning Returns does away with most of that. Things have evidently changed a lot in 500 years since Lightning slept. In place of the uniquely sci-fi style of the other games is something that is more straightforwardly fantasy. The first city, Luxarion, is a religious city of cathedrals and Gothic architecture, the standard template of a major city in a fantasy setting. The city of Yusnan looks a bit more unique, having a bit more of a desert aesthetic, but still fits into expected fantasy. The biggest change would be in the Wildlands. It's the world's last bastion of nature, but somehow the vegetation has completely changed. In place of jungles and steppes is an open field, plains dotted with the most typical trees, a forest, essentially the starting area of every JRPG since Dragon Quest I. Yet another hard shift into standard fantasy. Taken as a whole, it feels as though the goal with the art direction in Lightning Returns is to move it in line with the rest of the series, shaving off much of the defining elements of the trilogy until it's something much less unique. Even if I am disappointed with this choice, that isn't to say the game looks bad. Even if Luxarian is a more common visual style than Cocoon cities, the massive towers, sprawling layout, and checkerboard tiling on the streets leave a lasting impression. It's just an impression I can more readily compare to other media. The other significant unexpected change is with the battle system. 13 created a one-of-a-kind flavor of combat with the paradigm system, one that 13.2 made lots of small improvements to. Lightning Returns could have taken the opportunity to perfect it. Instead, it crafts something new that hits some of the same notes as the paradigm system while being completely different at its core. Instead of queuing up moves that the character will execute when their ATB meter fills, combat's much more hands-on. Pressing the attack button to attack with Lightning's weapon will cause her to attack with the weapon. It's essentially an action game. The paradigm system pushed a JRPG battle as close as it could to reflexive play, but since Lightning Returns embraces action game mechanics, it can fully commit to Twitch reflex gameplay. The clearest example of that is the need to block. You're incentivized to spend as little time as possible blocking, since it drains the ATB meter, and blocking just as an attack hits rewards you with more stagger on the enemy. The ATB meter is still here, keeping a cap on how many moves you can do before needing to take a break. It leaves battles more strategic than more hack and slash fare, since you need to keep in mind how much ATB you have, how much each move costs, and how much you might need to hold on to in case you need to block. The stagger gauge returns as well, proving to be the real nugget of great design the Final Fantasy series carried forward. Hitting enemies without stopping, hitting their elemental weaknesses, and blocking at just the right time all build up stagger. When you max out stagger, the enemy topples over and you deal exponentially more damage to them. Just like in the previous games, staggering enemies as quickly as possible is really the main goal of each fight. The most clear similarity between these two battle systems are their namesakes. Final Fantasy XIII had paradigms, roles you switch between mid-battle to give your party members different moves to suit the situation. Lightning Returns has schemata, a set of abilities and stats that Lightning can switch between on the fly. The dividing feature here is garb. Every piece of armor that Lightning equips is essentially a different class. They give different stat bonuses to health, attack, magic, and ATB, and come with locked-in abilities that can't be swapped out. The garb is the center of each schema that you build. What attacks you fill the rest of the 4 slots with, what accessories and weapons you equip, will be built around the specialization of the garb you choose. Lightning can take 3 different schema into battle. The most obvious path would be to make one schema focus on physical attacks, one focused on magic attacks, and one made for defending, but there is wiggle room for more interesting ideas if a player wants to experiment. Maybe take one schema that does little damage but builds quick stagger, one that only gives out debuffs, and one that does slow, big damage when the enemy is staggered. With how many different garbs are in the game, players can really mess around and find the one that speaks to them. Schemata add an extra layer to the reflexive nature of the combat, needing to quickly pick the right one for the right moment. You often can't just press the block button to react to attacks, since your offensive schema might not have a guard equipped. You need to swap to your defensive schema and then block, all with that same split-second timing you'd need in an action game. When you're flustered, it's frustrating to switch to the wrong schema and do the wrong move. When you've got the system down, it feels great to effortlessly flow between whatever moveset fits the exact moment in battle. My absolute favorite thing about the schemata system may seem minor, but became a major force in my drive to complete content. Every garb Lightning can equip completely changes the outfit she's wearing. Garb choice then becomes a balance of what gives me the best stats and moves, and what gives me good stats and moves and also looks the best. You can further tweak Lightning's appearance with accessories she can wear like glasses and hats and tattoos. The final ingredient is custom color palettes, letting you change the look of every garb to be more to your liking. Lots of players will end up using the best garb, but they can still be unique in the way they look. Dressing up Lightning being my main drive to keep playing may seem ridiculous, but in the modern landscape of gaming, where costumes and skins are relegated to microtransactions and extra purchases, having the freedom to customize your character feels so free and rewarding. Lightning Returns did have garb locked behind DLC, but on PC, all that garb comes for free. As gaming continues to move into less consumer-friendly directions, aspects of older games that didn't even stand out upon release can become these shining beacons of how some things really were better back in the day. That being said, there are a few issues with the combat that prevent it from being the best in the trilogy. The least subjective reason would be the change to the stagger gauge. The issue is that it isn't a stagger gauge anymore. In place of the clear visualization of exactly how close the enemy is to being staggered is a waveform that gets bigger as the enemy approaches the stagger point. Now knowing when the enemy will be staggered is a guessing game. Sure, you can tell they're close when the wave is tall and the color starts to change. It'll probably only take a few more hits, but it would still be better to know exactly how many more hits that'll be. The wavelength may look stylish, but when you're trading style for the amount of clarity that was lost, it's not a worthy trade. It's honestly baffling why this change was made when the first two games got it right so easily. The other, more subjective pitfall of Lightning Returns' combat is that it isn't quite engaging enough to sustain the game's runtime. Getting new garbs and new moves means that you will be regularly trying new things, and that keeps battles fresh. Despite that, there will come a point where the player finds a few outfits and moves they like best, ones with stats that will carry them to the endgame. When you lock into the setup you like best, it's only a matter of time till every fight starts to feel the same. Action games don't usually have this problem because they rarely stretch past 15 hours in a single playthrough. Lightning Returns is still ostensibly an RPG, so it takes 30 or 40 hours to see the game to its conclusion. Even if those RPG mechanics extend the gameplay's enjoyment, there's still going to be a decent number of hours in the back half where battles feel more like a chore than a treat. The saving grace here is that this only applies to normal battles. For bosses, that moveset familiarity will only serve you well. Boss encounters are balanced well enough that they force attentive play, and knowing you can rely on the moves and equipment you've picked puts players into that moment-to-moment mindset that action games thrive in. Despite their issues, it's fortunate that the areas still prove to be enjoyable to explore and that the combat manages to stay consistently fun, because those two things are what you will be doing for the entire game. Final Fantasy XIII was a warped mirror of much of the early 7th generation's design ethos. Lightning Returns proves to be the same for the generation's latter half, where tight corridors and curated experience were beginning to give way to the massive explosion of open-world sandboxes that served as the bridge between generations 7 and 8. This game is all about being an open-world sandbox. Every decision, from gameplay to structure to story, is made to serve that goal. The main story is split into 5 quest chains, 1 in each area and 2 in the most wide-open one, and the player can tackle them in any order they would like. You might be ushered to begin the quest labeled with a 1 first, but you're encouraged to explore elsewhere before you see its conclusion. Lightning Returns is as much a sandbox as any Bethesda game, and definitely more so than any Ubisoft one. Quests and areas do vary in difficulty, but waiting to complete a major quest till later usually results in that quest encounter scaling to meet your power level, meaning the game should remain consistently engaging no matter what order you do things. I said before that 13.2 emphasized player freedom and choice, but that level of choice is nothing compared to the actual freedom given in Lightning Returns. Of course, there needs to be a twist here that sets the game apart from standard open world fare, or this wouldn't be a Final Fantasy XIII game. That twist is the clock. The appeal of open world games like Skyrim or Grand Theft Auto is their laissez-faire, choose-your-own-adventure nature. Players get to engage with whatever content they want to, sinking infinite hours into these worlds, constantly amassing better weapons, more money, and higher stats until they essentially own the place. Lightning Returns denies the player of this by putting the whole game on a timer. The world has 13 days until it's destroyed, and that is how long the player has to save who they can. An in-game day lasts 1 real-world hour. The clock stops for cutscenes and battles, but essentially, you have 13 hours to complete as many quests as you can. Whereas something like Skyrim might be relaxing and mostly frictionless, Lightning Returns puts constant stress on the player. You can't simply engage with content on a whim. You need to plan your days ahead of time, grouping quests by location, finding the shortest route between destinations, and weighing the costs and benefits of one action over another. It requires constant attention that few games truly demand. Players need to be fully present in the world of the game in order to best use their time. An obvious thought would be, hey, if my time is limited, shouldn't I just beeline all the main quests as quickly as possible? The answer to that question is, you could try, but you will most certainly fail. The reason for this lies in the way that Lightning Returns further trims the number-crunching aspects of RPGs. There are no experience points in this game, no leveling up. The only way to permanently increase things like health and damage is by completing quests. Side note, usually no experience for random battles would make participating in battles a complete waste of time, but here, enemies drop stronger attacks, new pieces of equipment, and give a consistent source of money you'll definitely need to buy new weapons and garbs, so Lightning Returns thankfully sidesteps that issue. Main quests do give these stat rewards, far better than standard quests, but they withhold them till the end of each quest line. If you only participate in the required quests, Lightning won't be getting any stronger, and those big chunks of stats will be out of your reach because you won't be strong enough to beat the boss at the end of the quest chain. You need to be constantly completing side quests to stand a chance. If strength isn't a big enough incentive to do them, quest completion also rewards you with more time. The god Munavelza will awaken and create his new world in 13 days, but the chaos is working at an accelerated rate, and will destroy the world before those 13 days pass. The only way to ensure that Lightning has those 13 days to complete her task is to gather enough soul energy, called Aradia, to counteract the effect of chaos. Lightning earns some of this Aradia every time she saves a soul, and that means helping with whatever little task is stopping them from moving on. Just like with stats, main quest completion gives a large amount of Aradia at once, and completing all main quests gives you about enough time to extend the limit to 13 days on its own. But if you're not extending the timer while progressing to the end of those big quests, you might run out of time to see them through. When I said every decision in the game was made to reinforce the open world, I meant it. Even if you had the stats for it, you still couldn't barge through the main story content. At nearly every step of the 5 core quests is a different roadblock that either requires you to travel somewhere else entirely, to talk to someone, or pick up some item, or to come back later for some time-sensitive event to occur. Can't go into that graveyard where the bad guys are, the gates don't open till 10 PM. Can't go find that relic, it's blocked by a magic tornado that can only be stopped by killing a monster that sits right in front of the tornado, but won't spawn in front of the tornado until you talk to a guy who tells you need to kill a monster to stop the tornado. And Hope won't stop calling me and telling me what to do, but I know what to do, Hope, you already called me 3 seconds ago.
My sensors are picking up chaos in me. If you want to sneak into the Augur's quarter, you have to...
From a game design perspective, these roadblocks turn the game into a kind of a fun puzzle box, where players need to constantly track things across time and space to get them done. From a player perspective, these roadblocks are hackneyed time wasters put in place to make sure you can't beat the game as fast as you clearly want to. They can put in place any story justification they want, but no matter how hard they try, it's a thin layer of purpose any player can see right through. The only saving grace is the way some of these obstacles can be overcome in multiple ways. One example is in Yusnan, where you need to collect some fireworks for reasons. You could travel across town to different firework launchers and collect them that way, or you could talk to the Chocobo girls and get the few ahead of time, or you could participate in the Colosseum and earn half the amount you need for winning the battle. If the game's going to so often block the player from doing what they want, it's at least nice to let them choose how they get the busy work done. Busy work is, unfortunately, the correct word for most of the game's content. The vast majority of quests would be right at home in any MMO, a veneer of story covering trite trinket collection or monster slaying. The only thing holding a surprising amount of people back from moving on to the new world is some misplaced item. The game at least signposts what kind of quest you're usually getting into. The least engaging fare is all found on quest boards in each zone, easy objectives you can pick up in chunks and passively complete as you explore and hunt your way through the more involved content. Most of the more involved quests don't leave much of an impact though. Their stories are slightly more fleshed out, but still revolve around fetching or killing. They tend to be the least enjoyable kind of quests because they lack the flair and importance of main story quests, but pick up the same roadblock-filled design. They just give you far less rewards for overcoming them. That's not to say none of the quests try, though. Some of them do their best to put the concept of immortality to use. A man who took to journaling his life, which ballooned far past what he could have expected, has decided to use his final days reading through the many volumes he's penned. He just needs to track down that first book from when his life was normal. A machine operating on low power mode to live as long as his human companions, now dying before the humans he was supposed to live far beyond. A child that loved to cry wolf stunted in her growth, growing more desperate in her antics to receive the same amount of attention she did hundreds of years ago. Not every story here is an excuse for more content, but even those that reach for more are let down by the process of actually completing them. The worst offenders in this regard are easily the 3rd and 5th main story quests, both located in the Wildlands. The trouble with them is that neither of them really are main quest lines. They're just roadblocks that force you to run around and play more side quests. The 3rd quest is the more annoying one, in my opinion. It centers around a rare white chocobo that must be nursed back to health. Lightning needs to feed the chocobo to help its recovery, and the only way to get that food is by doing Wildlands side quests. So, you need to run around doing whatever quest you can find that reward you with food and medicine, and come back and give them to the chocobo. The reward is pretty great though. You can ride the healthy chocobo and get around a lot faster, something really appreciated when you're on a deadline. Except, you're still not done. Sure, the chocobo can run, but he still can't fly, so you need to run around and find even more quests that give food and medicine. And after about 7 or 8 total quests, the chocobo is finally back to full health, and he can take you to that one far-off location that he was needed to fly to. Of all the annoying runarounds the game sends you on, spending a large chunk of time healing a single chocobo when the whole world will end in 13 days feels like a huge waste of time. The reveal at the end that the chocobo is actually lightning summon Odin, who had been transformed, doesn't help things either. It only made me ask, but why was he a chocobo though? The 5th main quest is only slightly better. A young boy's soul has been split into fragments, and you need to go reclaim them. You get a clue that guides you to each fragment, but they're scattered across all 4 zones, and most require some arbitrary extra step to get. The most ridiculous of these is, just like with the Yusan fireworks, a Colosseum battle. Why does this person have a fragment of this boy's soul? Because the thing she really needs can only be one in the Colosseum, and if we give her the fragment, then players will need to go do a fight in the Colosseum to get it back. The structure of this questline suggests that it's something you pick up early on in the game and complete while you're in each area doing something else, but this is the only main quest that can't be completed at the start of the game. You need to play Quest 3 and heal the chocobo before you can even start Quest 5. On top of that, it is listed as main Quest 5 out of 5 total main quests, suggesting that if players want to tackle things in a predetermined order, this will be the last one they attempt. Add all that together, and the final mandatory part of the game many players will do before the finale is a lengthy, arbitrary fetch quest that requires them to backtrack through every area in the game after they've already done so much backtracking, getting through the arbitrary roadblocks the other main quests made them overcome. The only reason this upset me less than main quest 3 is that by the time I reached it, I could quickly gather all the fragments, so it at least didn't take up too much of my playthrough. What almost made it worse than main quest 3 is the context behind it. That young boy with the lost soul is Dodge, the son of original 13 party member Saz. Saz has spent his immortal centuries scouring the dying world for pieces of his son's soul, but has largely given up and wallowed in anguish in his own pocket of the apocalypse. The issue I have with this is, well, why is Dodge's soul scattered around the world? This one poor kid was forced to become a l'Cie and turned into Crystal for the first game, and then went missing in the second, so his dad had to go find him in a DLC-only storyline. Wouldn't being stuck as a child for centuries have been punishment enough for whatever sin this child committed? Joking aside, the question of what happened to Dodge's soul is mostly rhetorical. It doesn't really matter what reason the game gives, because much like many of the side quests, that reason is just a band-aid excuse for a gameplay idea. Saving Dodge brings a heartfelt scene where Saz becomes his old happy self and finally gets his son back. It'd be more touching if that wasn't what already happened in Final Fantasy XIII. Since the actual narrative of Lightning Returns is thin till the finale, the bulk of the game's storytelling is centered around how the trilogy's cast have fared since the world ended. Like most aspects of Lightning Returns, this proves to be a mixed bag. While some characters develop in tragic ways that are true to their character, others are forced to retread the same character progression that the first game put them through. Saz's story in 13 is of a single father willing to sacrifice everything to save his son, learning along the way that it does more good to hold on to hope than to give in to defeat. That is exactly what his story in Lightning Returns is as well. Saz has, understandably given the amount of time, reverted to his defeatist nature, but Lightning saving his son shows him that he really needed to hold on to the belief that his son could be saved. Having Saz essentially play out the same story a second time, with far less detail and nuance, does him and the rest of the game a disservice. It only gives a sense that this game didn't have enough juice to live on its own ideas, and that it needed to dip back into the same bag of tricks the trilogy had already used. Vanille fares much like Saz. Her even appearing in this game feels forced. Vanille and Fang were released from the pillar they formed at the end of 13 a little over a decade before Lightning Returns begins, for specific reasons the game cites, and for actual reasons like we want the whole cast to be in the final game of the trilogy. Like many characters in the 13 trilogy, Vanille turns out to be the chosen one in multiple ways. Vanille is not simply the famed pulse terrorist l'Cie of ancient history, she is also a speaker of the dead chosen by Bunavelza in the world's last days. When she awoke from crystal stasis, Vanille began to hear the voices of the dead calling out to her from the chaos that enveloped the world. This led to her being picked up by the church in Luxarion, where she is revered as a holy figure. In Final Fantasy XIII, Vanille was the cheerleader of the group, doing everything in her power to make sure the others remained happy. Beneath that bubbly veneer, though, it was a deeply guilt-ridden person who wanted nothing more than to sacrifice herself heroically, hoping to somehow make up for the damage she caused as a Pulse l'Cie so long ago. She did end up getting her wish, joining Fang in a sacrifice to stop Cocoon from falling into the planet. In Lightning Returns, Vanille is at least not so bubbly on the outside. She lets that depressive side show more readily. She is the only one who hears the desperate cries of the dead, how they cry for some kind of peace. To that end, she wants nothing more than to sacrifice herself heroically, hoping to somehow make up for the damage she caused as a Pulse l'Cie so long ago. Another character repeating their story. The most conflicted character arc is, fittingly, Lightning herself. Lightning in Final Fantasy XIII was a cold, calculated soldier. She had closed herself off from everyone around her, even Sarah, her only family member. Military life taught her to take orders and carry them out without question, so when she was branded l'Cie, she immediately submitted to the sentence that it was. By traveling with the others, clashing in ideologies and outlooks, Lightning learned to fight back against authority, to care for other people, even if she didn't outwardly show that she did. Her position in 13.2 as Etro's lone guardian muddied the waters of her progression a bit. On one hand, it was her completely submitting to yet another authority figure and carrying out orders. On the other hand, she was taking it upon herself to save the entire world, because she had learned to care about the world and its people. It's a quandary that Lightning Returns continues. Bunavelza replaces Etro, but Lightning is still the lone savior of the world. Luckily, reconciling this paradox proved to be the real bulk of the story. As the 13 days progress, Lightning starts to question Bunavelza's intentions, concluding that she needs to keep playing along to save Sarah and everyone else on the planet, but as the time comes where Bunavelza shows himself to have some ulterior motive, she won't hesitate to fight back. She's no longer submitting to authority, she's merely working with someone while their goals align. Awesome, so Lightning gets to carry her arc forward with consideration of what came before, even while she's put in the same circumstances. Except, there's one aspect of her story in Lightning Returns that does the opposite of that. Early on, between days, Lightning is visited by Sarah's spirit, a reminder of the goals she is fighting towards. Once the conversation ends, Lightning realizes that despite the fact she just saw her sister for the first time in hundreds of years, she felt absolutely nothing. No happiness, no sadness, no anger, nothing. She starts to think that her resurrection as a pawn of Bunavelza locked away her emotions, that maybe she is a walking corpse without feeling. That's obviously not the case considering all the emotions she shows in literally every other cutscene in the game, but it's an intriguing development. Unfortunately, the truth behind this didn't quite land for me. It's actually the last revelation in the whole game. A magical young girl named Lumina constantly shows up across the story-relevant missions, taunting Lightning but never outright antagonizing her. She bears a striking resemblance to Sarah, but doesn't look exactly like her, and she has a different voice. Only at the very end is it revealed that Lumina is actually an aspect of Lightning herself. The core of Lightning's heart that she shut away all her life to be the hardened fighter she thought she needed to be. Lightning's lack of emotion wasn't a cruel trick of the gods, it was something she did to herself all her life that manifested into a physical separation when she was resurrected. I really appreciate how this puts Lightning as a person in the forefront, having her face her human struggles in a way only a fantasy story could. Despite that, it still rings with the same frequency as her character development in Final Fantasy XIII. Her story was already about warming up to other people and letting her guard down. She already made that breakthrough. If she wasn't swallowed up into a time warp, forced to fight as a servant of a god, put to sleep for centuries, and then woken up to serve yet another god, Lightning would have had time to really connect with the people around her, because she was clearly beginning to do that at the end of the first game. She may not have gotten that chance, but the need for Lumina to manifest and force Lightning to overcome her guarded nature doesn't feel necessary. Sure, the specifics of Saz, Vanille, and Lightning's characterization in this game are given story justification and are different from Final Fantasy XIII, but they're all hitting the same beats, making these characters feel like they've backslid in their growth. These stories largely emphasize the mandated feeling of this game's existence, and certainly feel like Saz and Vanille only appear out of obligation rather than any real reason. Luckily, the other half of the cast is much more successful in their characterization, particularly in the cases of the trilogy's two bodyguards, Noel and Snow. Noel always had every reason to be depressed. He was literally the last person alive in his own timeline, and the person he loved died in his arms, yet he always held that sorrow at bay. Indirectly causing the end of the world and having Sarah die in his arms as well proved to be too much for him. Noel has become a vicious, angry figure known as the Shadow Hunter. He largely hunts monsters or evildoers, but pits himself directly against Lightning in her quest to save souls. He, along with a death cult that he tries to distance himself from, found an oracle drive with a vision of the future. Though this vision isn't entirely clear, it seems to suggest that Lightning isn't out to save souls. She is in fact the harbinger of the end that will wipe out humanity once and for all. Noel and the cult, though once again Noel does not like the cult, make it their sole mission to kill Lightning to avert this fate. Lightning of course sorts this all out, and Noel pulls his punch when he has the opportunity to kill her, but the episode clearly shows that Noel has given into his darker emotions that were always within him. Like the rest of the Luxarian mission, it's tinged with edge that some may find laughable, but if you follow the arc of Noel's life, becoming a figure like the Shadow Hunter feels more than honest. Noel simply succumbed to the negativity that was always inside him. Snow, on the other hand, is a man who never faltered in the face of adversity that has finally been broken. The death sentence of a l'Cie never fazed him, nor did being trapped in different timelines alone. Learning that Sarah, his fiancée, had died, that he failed to protect her, is too much for him. Snow spent the past few hundred years leading the city of Yusnan. He did a leader's job of providing, but not nearly as well as the old Snow would have. Yusnan has a clear division between the haves and the have-nots. Instead of helping out the downtrodden, Yusnan uses its resources to have lavish parties every single night. Snow is finally done fighting, instead choosing to ensure that everyone has a good time before the world ends. It would feel like a betrayal of his character if his break wasn't so believable. Snow was always recklessly throwing himself into danger, feeling the need to lead and protect to a fault. Looking back though, he only ever seemed to fail. His rebellion in Cocoon did get innocent people killed. He never found Lightning during his time travels, and he ultimately failed in his main goal of keeping Sarah safe. From Snow's perspective, all signs say give up in big flashing lights. When Lightning manages to reach him, he's turning into a Seath. Turns out, Snow once again let himself become a l'Cie, this time connecting to a fallacy that's used to produce enough food to feed all the remnants of the world. He clearly has a death wish, wanting the same thing as Vanille for the same reasons. Lightning, shockingly, doesn't end up killing him. She breaks through his sadness and convinces him that people, including Sarah, can still be saved. He stops becoming a Seath, which shouldn't be able to happen and goes against everything the trilogy has set up. Even when the whole party stopped being in Season 13, it was later justified that Etra saving them, so maybe it's some residual boon of Velza magic Lightning has that saves him, but honestly at this point who really cares? And starts to become that old Snow we know and love. All of Lightning Returns is about saving people's souls, but out of all the many stories in this game, Snow's is the one that most feels like someone has been saved. Fang's main goal was always to help Vanille. So if Vanille is retreading ground, then Fang must be as well. Except, surprisingly, not really. Her goal to protect Vanille is the same, but her progression from 13 carries over and helps her more successfully accomplish that goal. Fang's arc was about learning to be a little less selfish and to trust more people. In Lightning Returns, the band of thieves she forms proves she learned the value of cooperation. She even joins Lightning while exploring the Dead Dunes, becoming the game's only real party member for a period of time. Though she learned to be more cooperative, she still keeps her rebellious tendencies. Fang learns the truth behind Vanille's new ability to speak to the dead, and the plans the church has for her. Fang's episode in the Dead Dunes ends up being the most critical to Lightning Returns' story. At the center of Luxarian's church is a massive swirl of spirits, one that Vanille constantly hears. On the final day before Bunavelza creates his new world, the church needs Vanille to perform a purifying ritual to cleanse the dead. Vanille agrees, thinking this is how she can put them to rest and atone for her past sins. In reality, the ritual will kill Vanille. That information is enough to cause Fang to fight back against the church, her goal becoming to stop the ritual. If that wasn't nefarious enough, it turns out that the souls of the dead that swim in the chaos are still souls, meaning they could still be saved and carried on to the new world. Bunavelza simply doesn't want that. From their perspective, the dead have too much negativity and resentment in their heart. If they're creating a perfect world, those things have no place in it, and thus the dead must be done away with. And thus, Bunavelza's true intentions come to light. They are concerned with purity and control. All the souls Lightning saved will populate the new world, but only after they've been stripped of their free will. Once again, Lightning needs to fight against gods and fate to let humanity carve their own destiny, and this trilogy reaches its climax. I'm going to pause here to talk a little bit about my playthrough. I was primarily concerned with seeing the game to its conclusion, and wasn't looking for 100% completion or anything like that. To that end, I planned my days in a way to effectively make my way through the main quests, doing side quests that were along the way or filled in empty time slots where I needed to wait for some time-sensitive event. I didn't completely skimp out on side content because, as I stated before, you need to be doing them to improve your stats, but I could have spent more time doing them. Much more, actually. I completed the 5th and final main quest on the 9th day, and thus had 4 days left to clear side content. Well, because my goal was to beat the game, and because the gameplay was beginning to wear out its welcome, and because most of the quests didn't feel very rewarding or engaging, I didn't really want to spend another 5 to 10 hours playing them, so I made an extra save file on day 10 in case I later decided I did want to play more side content, and then spent the last 4 days sleeping at an inn, because that's the only way to get right to the end of the game. I knew I'd be underpowered going into the finale, but I've played harder games, and I figured I would scrape by even if the fight took a long time. It was a very, very hard fight. Bunavelza is relentless, their damage is staggering, and especially if you're underleveled, their health pool is enormous. Despite that, I got really close to finishing them off after a few tries. Just to be sure I was on the right track on that fight, I looked up some of the recommended strategies to defeat them. This is where I learned Bunavelza has 4 phases. I had only approached the end of Phase 2. There was no way I could, with my current stats, ever defeat this boss. Okay, well the game luckily offers an optional dungeon right outside the final boss store that rewards you with the best garb and weapons in the game. I didn't necessarily want to do that dungeon, but if that is what I need to beat the game, I guess it needs to be done. I could only make it halfway through the dungeon because the mini-boss at this point was too strong for me to kill. I then realized I was soft-locked. I could not complete the game. I knew this was my fault, but the dread was still kicking in. This possibility is something the developers foresaw. If you fail to fight against Bunavelza once, a crystal spawns outside the boss store that lets you immediately start New Game Plus. You carry over your stats and gear, and you start the 13-day cycle once again, this time hopefully raising your stats enough to defeat Bunavelza and save humanity. It is very good that the developers saw the possibility of players not being strong enough to beat the game when they put a time limit on each run. Opening New Game Plus as an option pretty much guarantees that players will more than hold their own by the time they work their way back to the end. Rationally, I see how bold it is to tell players they simply didn't earn their victory, how much this proves the commitment to the time limit players need to work within. Emotionally, I was ready to be done with the game on day 9, and the game was now telling me to play the whole thing again just to see the ending. I thankfully had the foresight to make a backup save, so I wouldn't have to spend 25 hours repeating content, but if a player was in my position and didn't have any extra saves, they just need to play it all again. Any negative feelings I had toward the game, its story, its mechanics, all of it became heightened by this experience. I have tried my best to take time to separate my frustration at the end from the rest of my playthrough, but at the end of the day, I'm just a player playing a game, and this made me not like playing the game as much as I had before. Forcing me to play for longer than I had wanted didn't deepen my appreciation of the game, it only further showed me the issues I had with it. When the ending is reached, it's more of a formality than a payoff. By the time you enter Bunavelza's realm, the conclusion is already understood. If Lightning wins, humanity will move on to the new world, and without any gods above them, they will finally have true freedom. The extended scene of all the cast, the whole party from 13, Sarah, Noel, and Yule from 13-2 really is nice. All these characters have struggled for a frankly ridiculous amount of time, in Fang and Vanille's case over 1,000 years, and finally seeing them happy, safe, and hopeful is rewarding. I just wish I could have enjoyed the moment without having resentment at how I got there. The only surprising thing is the absolutely jaw-dropping reveal that the new world is in fact real-world Earth, and Lightning's narration is directly talking to you, the player, because she now exists in our world alongside us. She literally, actually, really became a Louis Vuitton model in the actual real world. She was interviewed for a magazine you can actually physically hold. I cannot stress enough how mind-breaking it is that Lightning lives in France in our world in the modern day. I can't even think of the narrative implications, or if I like the decision in the universe of the new world being Earth, because I'm scared of what might happen if I happen to run into Lightning on the street. End of video. Thank you.